Good morning, I'm Deirdre Bolton. Today on ABC News Live, Hurricane Fiona has devastated Puerto Rico, unleashing more than 2 feet of torrential rain, massive floods and mudslides, with more than 1,000 people rescued. Now most of the island is in the dark as the major hurricane heads north, with winds topping 115 miles per hour. ABC News Chief Meteorologist Ginger Z has the track and the timing. Immigration showdown overnight. A new criminal investigation targeting Florida Governor Ron DeSantis after flying that group of migrants to Martha's Vineyard. This is, as new numbers show, record apprehensions at the border. What's behind the surge as tensions flare with less than 50 days until midterm elections? Serial stunner, the subject of the wildly popular podcast. Adnan Syed free this morning after more than 20 years in prison, now under house arrest. New evidence that got him out, and what comes next. Today, Hurricane Fiona became the first major hurricane of the 2022 Atlantic season, with winds up to 115 miles per hour as it moves right by Turks and Caicos. The storm has already knocked out power to most of Puerto Rico. We bring you now more on this top story with ABC News' Victor Oquendo.
Puerto Rico in the dark after powerful winds from Fiona knocked out power to nearly everyone on the island. Those winds non-stop for 2 days, dumping 30 inches of rain and leaving hundreds of thousands with no running water. 5 years after Hurricane Maria devastated the island, Fiona battering Puerto Rico, killing 1 person. The U.S. territory's governor calling the damage catastrophic. More than 1,000 people rescued. First responders in waist-deep floodwaters scouring this area in Añasco and rescuing people trapped in their homes. In Salinas, Ruben Ramos and his mother Onelia called 911 at midnight.
The
water, she says that the water was running just like this, but inside of her house. But firefighters couldn't reach them for 7 hours. What was it like when the firefighters arrived? ¿Cómo sintieron cuando los bomberos llegaron?
Oh. Felicidad, que estamos a salvo.
Felicidad, you were happy, you were relieved.
Happy.
Small communities underwater. In the mountain town of Utuado, a torrent of floodwater tearing apart this temporary bridge rebuilt after Maria and sweeping it away. Take a look at this dam. Residents tell me they have never seen it like this. And Fiona, it's not done with Puerto Rico yet. This plantain farm in Guanica, damaged by those 85-mile-per-hour winds, gusts reaching 100 miles per hour. This woman saying she knows nothing because she doesn't have access to anything. Residents traveling to neighboring towns, desperate for supplies and gasoline. Now Turks and Caicos preparing for the wrath of the strengthening hurricane. Fiona barreling over the Dominican Republic as it made its second landfall early Monday morning. 80-mile-per-hour winds whipping across Punta Cana. West of the popular resort town, Fiona's impact hitting Higüey hard. Roads collapsing, debris pouring into the streets, and the roofs of homes blown off. This home now uninhabitable. President Biden is promising to help here. The White House saying that more than 300 federal personnel are already working to assist with response and recovery, and that is really just the beginning. Once some more damage assessments are done, that number should increase significantly. We should also mention that FEMA's administrator is headed here to Puerto Rico today. Deirdre?
Victor, thank you so much. Victor Oquendo. ABC News Chief Meteorologist Ginger Z tracking Fiona for us. She has the timing and the path of this Category 3 hurricane. Hi, Ginger.
Deirdre, Fiona is now the first major hurricane of the season, meaning Category 3 or higher. And so it is a Cat 3, and it will go higher. We're going to see it intensify to a 4. But thankfully, it is just east of the Turks and Caicos. It's going to move north and sandwich, hopefully, right between Bermuda and mainland U.S. So we will see impacts along the East Coast. If you have any plans at the water, that's where you're going to see it. High surf, rip current threat will be high all the way from really New England's coast down to Miami. But I want you to really pay attention to the timing and the proximity to Bermuda. Anyone who has interest there in the next 48 hours is going to be watching just how close you get, because you're on the wrong side of this, meaning the bad side. But thankfully, it's looking like it moves a little farther west, which would be wonderful because impacts would be lessened. One other mention, we are still in kind of the peak time of hurricane season, and unfortunately, we've got a lot of interest on the map there. That 40% chance that's just north of South America, that one, the long-term models are trying to take it into the Gulf late next week. You know, we will be all over that. and covering it for you. Deirdre?
Ginger Z, thank you so much. In the meantime, an American Navy veteran is free this morning after being held captive in Afghanistan for nearly 3 years. Mark Frericks, he arrived safely in Qatar after being freed by the Taliban in exchange for a convicted drug trafficker with ties to the Taliban. Chief Global Affairs correspondent Martha Raddatz has the latest.
Nearly 3 years after he was abducted from a meeting in Kabul, Mark Frericks is safe in Doha, Qatar, flown there after a carefully orchestrated prisoner exchange. The 60-year-old Frericks, a Navy veteran and engineer working on aid projects in Afghanistan at the time he was kidnapped, is said to be in stable health this morning.
I want to thank all the people who've worked on this.
But Frericks' freedom was not without cost. The U.S. releasing convicted Afghan drug trafficker Haji Bashir Noorzai, held since 2005 in the U.S., who was welcomed back into the arms of the Taliban like a conquering hero. President Biden releasing a statement saying bringing the negotiations that led to Mark's freedom to a successful resolution required difficult decisions, which I did not take lightly. For years, there was no evidence that Frericks was alive. He had been transferred to Khost, a Taliban stronghold, and transferred to the powerful and violent Haqqani network. But in April of this year, The New Yorker obtained a hostage video with Frericks clearly reading from a script.
Please, release me.
Pleading for the Taliban to release him. Frericks' family expressing gratitude to the Biden administration.
We're elated that he's finally got released. I mean, it's long overdue in my estimation.
The family hopes to be reunited soon. The release, of course, comes as the Biden administration is trying to free WNBA star Brittany Griner and Paul Whelan from Russian detention. Deirdre?
Martha, thank you so much, Martha Raddatz. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has made a series of dramatic announcements in response to its failing special military operation in Ukraine. Russia says it will hold referendum votes in occupied Ukrainian territory to officially recognize the areas as Russian. Foreign correspondent Tom Sufi-Burridge joining me now live from Kharkiv, Ukraine. Tom, how significant is this announcement, and how could it affect the fighting?
This is a dramatic series of steps taken by the Kremlin, Deirdre. Let's deal with them one by one. Firstly, this idea that there'll be these referendums in parts of Ukraine occupied by the Russians right now, so effectively the east and the south in simple terms. I mean, that is effectively the Russians trying to legitimize their presence there, but I think also it really ups the risk of escalation because these will not be free and fair votes. The conclusion of these referenda is foregone. Russia will basically ensure that these are votes legitimizing its presence in its eyes here in Ukraine. And I think more broadly, it means that Russia in the future going forward will be able to see from its perspective that those parts of Ukraine are considered as Russian territory. And it potentially means that any attacks by Ukrainian forces and potentially with Western-supplied weapons, namely US-supplied weapons, are seen by the Russians as attacks on Russian territory. So I think it increases the risk in this conflict hugely. And then you have that idea of mass mobilization. Legislation is being rushed through the Russian parliament right now, and that would effectively massively increase the pool of men from the ages of 17 to 27 initially that the Russian military could call on to force them into this war. And we've just spoken to an analyst in Moscow right now. We can't name him for his own personal safety, but he thinks also that the Russian state is moving towards martial law. So all in all, this is a dramatic move by the Kremlin. It increases the risks in this war, increases the risks of escalation, and it shows that Putin is doubling down. He's not going to back down, even though on the battlefield, his military have seen a series of defeats in recent days.
Moving towards, or this idea of moving towards martial law, that is a very strong statement indeed, Tom. Meanwhile, we see Russia stepping up its attacks on civilian infrastructure in response to the successful counter-offensive that we've seen near Kharkiv. That's where you are. What is the latest?
Well, we're seeing on the ground here quite a sort of dramatic move, I think, within the last few hours. We're hearing a lot of, in the last few hours, outgoing fire from the Ukrainians east from here, effectively, because Kharkiv city, where we are now, is about a 3-hour drive down towards the front line. Yesterday, we were in Izium, a newly liberated city by the Ukrainian forces. We saw a huge amount of military activity around there. We just had 2 fighter jets, we believe, fly over our hotel here. And all of this speaks of how the Ukrainian military seem to be trying to continue their momentum, trying to take even more territory in this northeasterly region of Ukraine to try and capitalize, I think, on Russian weaknesses right now. Now, the weather is turning here. You can probably hear and see the rain behind me. And that gives the Ukrainians a bit of a window. They know that once the ground gets soft underneath them, they won't be able to go on the offensive so easily. So the clock is ticking in that respect, but it all speaks of that kind of shifting dynamic in the Ukrainians' favor and against Russia right now, and why we're seeing this dramatic response by Vladimir Putin today. We expect Vladimir Putin to address the Russian people tonight on state TV.
Thank you, as always, Tom, and stay safe, as always. Tom Sophie Burridge joining us there from Ukraine. Coming up, a criminal investigation has been launched into the migrant flight ordered by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. You are live with ABC News. Stay with us. Welcome back. A criminal investigation has been launched into the migrant flights ordered by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. A Texas sheriff is accusing Republicans of playing politics with human lives, saying those migrants were lured onto flights with false promises of work and opportunity. The investigation comes as the government reports that in the past year, apprehensions at the border topped 2 million for the first time in history. Congressional correspondent Rachel Scott has the latest.
A Texas sheriff launching a criminal investigation against Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, just days after he flew dozens of migrants to Martha's Vineyard.
They had a right to not be preyed upon and played for a fool and transported halfway across the country just for the sake of a media event, of a video opportunity.
Bexar County Sheriff Javier Salazar insisting the migrants were lured under false pretenses, promised work in a hotel, but instead shuttled to an airport and dropped in Massachusetts, all to make a political point.
That's enraging. It doesn't matter how you look at it, it's enraging. I believe there's some criminal activity involved here.
DeSantis' office defending the move, claiming immigrants are more than willing to leave Bexar County after being enticed across the border to fend for themselves, adding Florida provided an opportunity in a sanctuary state with resources as expected. At the southern border, a record number of crossings, apprehensions topping 2 million for the first time ever. That's a 175% increase from last August. Across the country, cities are overwhelmed by the influx. El Paso opening up an emergency processing facility. The mayor of New York considering cruise ships as temporary housing.
Border officials say what is behind these record numbers are migrants fleeing economic hardship and violence. But look, we have never seen border crossings this high, and it's bringing immigration back into the spotlight with less than 50 days to go until the midterm elections. Deirdre?
Rachel, thank you so much. Rachel Scott. And ABC News political reporter Brittany Shepard with me now for more. Brittany, apprehensions at the border topping a record 2 million this year for the first time ever. We can't underline that enough. These governors are blaming Democrats and President Biden's policies. So what's driving the surge?
Well, Deidre, I think it's important to remember where exactly these migrants are coming from and this historic influx on the southern border. I think maybe contrary to popular belief and knowledge that many of these immigrants aren't coming directly from Mexico. In fact, they're coming from Venezuela, where a bulk, if not all of those migrants who were flown to Martha's Vineyard just last week came from Cuba and from other parts of South America. And the White House has said previously that poor relationship between those countries' governments in the U.S. of corruption and crime are driving those migrants to look for somewhere safe to stay and bolstered up to come to the United States. They've also doubled down in the past saying that a lot of what the Trump administration's, what they believe stringent, hardline immigration policies, including the Remain in Mexico policy that was doubled down during the onset of the coronavirus pandemic, have forced these migrants to have no other choice but to look for asylum somewhere safe and sound, and for them, that was those many states along the southern border, including Texas.
Brittany, it sounds like the Republican governor's not backing down. Can we expect more migrants sent to sanctuary cities?
I think chief among those governors are Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and he said very plainly he's sitting on $12 million, and he will exhaust those funds and try to ask for more to use from the state of Florida to move migrants to prove a point as much as possible to get in Democrats' face. But let's put a really point on this, to put in Joe Biden's face, that he has the power and the wherewithal, even though that power is being illegally challenged. We heard in Texas, and I'm sure lawsuits to come all around the country. And I think there'll be a lot of other governors who are following suit. We're seeing some of this busing and training and planing from Arizona Governor Doug Ducey, who's term limited and will be leaving at the end of his term, and from Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who is running for re-election against Beto O'Rourke. And I think it'll be curious to see what other Republican governors follow suit, and in fact, maybe just wealthy benefactors. A bunch of migrants have showed up in Sacramento, Venezuelan migrants, and no one has yet claimed ownership of who's moved those migrants from Texas to California, and I believe that pattern will repeat itself in the next few weeks. And of course, I believe in those 50 days to the midterms in November, Deirdre.
Important marker. Brittany, thank you so much. Brittany Shepard with us there. Now to that stunning reversal in the case that inspired the Serial podcast. A judge throwing out Adnan Syed's murder conviction after 23 years behind bars. Steve Osunsami has the latest.
This was the moment after 23 years, the first steps to freedom for Adnan Syed. It's fair to say that he's now on the better side of the door to a prison cell.
This is a prepaid call from
Adnan Syed.
Because of the wildly popular podcast Serial that's been downloaded by listeners more than 300 million times. It was the podcast that questioned long ago whether he was the true killer of his 19-year-old ex-girlfriend, Hae Min Lee. She was murdered in 1999.
I mean, no way I had absolutely nothing to do with Hae's murder.
The series helped lead to a new investigation by the current prosecutor in Baltimore, who convinced a judge to overturn his conviction.
We're not yet declaring Adnan Syed is innocent, but we are declaring that in the interest of fairness and justice, he is entitled to a new trial.
He has always maintained his innocence, including in the series where they interviewed him on a prison phone.
It is what it is. If someone believes me or not, I have no control over it.
His ex-girlfriend was his high school sweetheart, seen here in a rare interview featured in the podcast.
I played field hockey for 2 years. I've played lacrosse for 3 years, and I also managed boys wrestling.
State investigators say they found 2 other potential suspects in the case who were there all along, both with records of prior violence towards women, and one who prosecutors say actually threatened to kill the young woman. The judge who released Syed from prison is now accusing former prosecutors of withholding crucial evidence.
We learned that during the original investigation, one of the suspects were improperly cleared by investigators based on faulty polygraph tests.
Investigators also say that cell phone data presented at trial was unreliable, and it was that data that helped to place Syed at the spot where his ex-girlfriend was buried. His mother, seen here after he was released, was overjoyed.
We are so grateful for those people who help us.
Adnan and, of course, Hae Min Lee's family have suffered immeasurably, and that is what happens when the state fails to do their obligation under the law.
The state attorney general of Maryland is now defending the former prosecutor, saying that they made everything they had available to defense lawyers. And we should underline that the family of the victim, they're having a tough time with all of this, saying that they feel betrayed by the current prosecution. The judge has ordered this man sentenced to home detention. He has to wear an ankle monitor while he waits for a decision on whether he gets a new trial. The current prosecutors have 30 days to make that decision, and after that point, he is free for good. Deirdre?
Steve, thank you so much. Steve Osunsami. And of course, you can listen to the new episode of Serial that dropped this morning. And the title is Adnan is Out. It is streaming now on all podcast platforms. Coming up, today's top headlines, including the class action lawsuit against the city of Jackson, Mississippi for the ongoing water crisis there. More on that subject and more in less than 2 minutes. Welcome back to ABC News Live. Sherry Papini, the governor, or rather the California mother of two who faked her 2016 disappearance, has been sentenced to 18 months in prison, more than double what prosecutors asked for. Papini told authorities she'd been kidnapped by two Hispanic women. In a statement on Monday, her sister calling her disturbed, revealing that it was only on the day before she entered her guilty plea that she privately admitted for the first time ever that she had lied about everything to everyone. Residents of Jackson, Mississippi have filed a class action lawsuit against the city for the ongoing water crisis. It seeks relief and monetary damages against various government and private engineering defendants, alleging years of neglect leading to this crisis affecting more than 150,000 people. The United Nations General Assembly is underway in New York, where world leaders are meeting in person amid multiple global crises. The assembly opened with a performance by poet Amanda Gorman, who rose to fame during President Biden's inauguration.
We chime it for the climate, for our communities. We shall respect and protect every part of this planet, hand it to every heart on this earth until no one's worth is rendered by the race, gender, class, or identity they were born. This morn, let it be sworn that we are one human kin.
Most leaders must give their remarks in person, but the UN voted to allow Ukrainian President Zelensky to address world leaders in a pre-recorded speech tomorrow. Millions of people from across England and the world said their final farewell to Queen Elizabeth II yesterday. Now the royal family is paying one more tribute. Foreign correspondent James Longman is at Buckingham Palace with the story.
An emotional final farewell to Queen Elizabeth II and her 70 years of service. Away from the cameras, there was a private burial as Elizabeth was reunited with her beloved husband, Prince Philip, laid to rest beside him at King George VI Memorial Chapel in Windsor, where her parents and sister also lie. The service following a day of solemn tribute. Public military ritual, but at its heart, a family mourning their matriarch. King Charles III and Princess Anne by her mother's side every step of the way. Grandsons William and Harry, along with Princess Kate, Duchess Meghan and Queen Consort Camilla, and the Queen's great-grandchildren, George and Charlotte, there too. Nearly 2,000 people, including President Biden and the First Lady, packed into Westminster Abbey for the funeral service. On top of her coffin, a handwritten note from her son, the new king, reading, "In love and devoted memory." After the church service, sailors from the Royal Navy escorted their commander-in-chief by Buckingham Palace, where members of the royal household staff waited outside to say goodbye. Then to Windsor, where thousands of well-wishers and the Queen's two corgis patiently awaited her arrival. Waiting also the Queen's fell pony, Emma, standing as the Queen's coffin passed, and on her saddle, one of Her late Majesty's famous scarves. At St George's Chapel, she was separated from the regalia of monarchy one last time, the sceptre, orb and imperial state crown removed from her coffin, before it was lowered into the royal vault. The Queen's piper playing his final song. Then, God Save the King, ringing out as an emotional King Charles watched his mother return to his father. The royal family paid one more tribute, sharing this photo of the Queen, quoting Hamlet, writing, "May flights of angels sing thee to thy rest."
The national period of mourning here in Britain has now ended and flags have returned to full mast on government buildings. But for the royal family, their period of mourning continues for another week, and we won't see any senior members carrying out any public duties during that time. Britain and the world now just getting used to life without Elizabeth. Deirdre.
James, thank you. James Longman. I'm Deirdre Bolton. Stay with us. ABC News Live continues with more news, context, and analysis.
Hi everyone, George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.